Hi everyone. Welcome to the Metropolitan Futures Initiative Quarterly Report webinar. I'm Patricia DeVoe from the UCI School of Social Ecology, and I just want to thank all of you for joining us today and taking the time to learn more about the latest Metropolitan Futures Initiative reports. The first one is Detecting Job Density Over Time, and the second one released is Understanding Business Churning Dynamics in Their Spatial Variation. During this presentation, feel free at any time to type questions in the chat box on your screen. We will answer any questions at the end of the presentation. And also, if for some reason you need to exit the presentation early, please note that we are recording this presentation and will email it to all attendees, the replay video link, so you can watch and even share it with other colleagues. Before we begin, let me first introduce you to our presenters today, John Hipp and Kevin Kane. John Hipp is the director of the Metropolitan Futures Initiative. He's a professor in the Department of Criminology, Law and Society, the Department of Policy, Planning and Design, and the Department of Sociology. He is a co-director of the Irvine Lab for the Study of Space and Crime. His research interests focus on how neighborhoods change over time, how that change both affects and is affected by neighborhood crime, and the role networks and institutions play in that change. He approaches these questions using quantitative methods as well as social network analysis. Kevin Kane is a postdoctoral research fellow in the Department of Planning, Policy, and Design. He's an economic geographer interested in the quantitative spatial analysis of urban land use change and urban development patterns, municipal governance, institutions, and economic development. He approaches these questions using quantitative methods and high-resolution spatial data. So now I'd like to turn over the presentation to John and Kevin.
Thanks very much, Patricia, and thanks to all of you for joining us today. I'm happy to have you here. I want to say a few words about the Metropolitan Futures Initiative. I am the director of it, and then we'll move on to the two quarterly reports. Kevin will present the first one, and I'll be presenting the second one. Just to give you a little bit of background on the Metropolitan Futures Initiative, we've been around for several years now. Who are we? Since you can't see us, here's some photos of us. I'm the director. Kevin, as mentioned, is a postdoctoral scholar here with the MFI, and Jae-Hong Kim is another who works currently on both of these reports. In fact, he was the lead author of the second one. He just happens to be out of the country, so I'm sort of pinch hitting for him and presenting some of those results that we've all worked on together. So that's who we are and what is the MFI. We've been around for several years now. One big focus of us is trying to provide data-driven research, and we're very interested in trying to understand the problems facing the region, and we approach those in a data-driven manner, if you will. In part, a lot of the work we have is trying to combine a lot of different data sources together into a large data set. With that can allow us to address various questions that we might wish to address. That data set has a lot of spatial precision to us, and we've always worked with spatial precision, but it's been enhanced with the addition of Kevin to our team, who has a geography background. It's a longitudinal data set. We approach these questions because we're very interested in understanding not only where the region has been and where it is currently, but trying to understand or at least make projections about where it may be going in the future, and that's an important part of our research that we do. And we do that with sophisticated statistical analyses. And as part of that, of course, we as academics, we publish in peer-reviewed journals. But another very important part of the MFI is trying to get our research out to the general public and various constituencies out there. And to do that, let me show you our website, which you may have already seen, but this sums up our key focus of what we try to provide to either policymakers or the general public or others who are just generally interested in our region. One main focus of our work is trying to provide videos of our research in the sense that we try to provide a summary of the research in a more accessible manner. We've got one video that's online currently for one of the reports we're presenting today. It's about a 5-6 minute video to give you the highlights of the report. And we've got another one for the other report that will be posted shortly. A second feature of how we try to outreach to people is through our actual quarterly reports. And this is a new report series. In the past, we've done a biannual large report that we put out every couple of years. Our first one was in 2012, second one in 2014. We've just switched to this new quarterly report series, which we hope will be a way to get our results out in a more timely manner to the public. So again, keep a lookout for these. Our next one will be coming out in October. But these first two we released on beginning of July, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. A third aspect of our website is these mapping applications that we've made available. And the idea with this is we've got these data that we've used for the various analyses, and we're going to be talking about to you today. But it's also possible for folks to go to our website, go to these maps, and take a look for yourself if there's particular areas you want to look at or zoom in more closely, that we've made that available to people. So that's another part of our outreach of what we try to do for making this information available to the public. Finally, we do various outreach. One of them is, of course, this webinar we're doing right now today. Recently, Kevin and I appeared on the City Square radio show talking about some of our research, and we give various presentations, etc. So all these are various ways that we try to outreach to the public and try to bring this information to people. So with that said, that gives you a bit of a setup of what the MFI is. Now at this point, I'm going to be turning it over to Kevin, and Kevin's going to talk about our first quarterly report.
Well, thanks, John. I appreciate the introduction, and definitely appreciate everyone who was able to log in to look at our research today. So I'm going to be discussing the first of the two quarterly reports that we released on July 1st. And this one's called Detecting Job Density Over Time. We were really interested in kind of understanding the spatial distribution of employment across the region and how that's been changing, given the importance of the local economy and policymakers and stakeholders and everything like that. So I'm going to start here just by showing a map of the Southern California region and highlighting downtown Los Angeles. Now, why are we highlighting downtown Los Angeles? Certainly we know this is a fairly dispersed metropolitan region that we all live in, but most urban economists and most urban scholars really start with this idea that a downtown is central to understanding a region. I'm just going to show a hypothetical image here, and this might look a little bit crazy to you from the perspective of Southern California. This is what Los Angeles would look like if it were what we call a monocentric city, if employment density was centered around the downtown. And again, this is really the starting point for a lot of scholars as they look at cities. It's really not realistic. This is the actual employment distribution across the Southern California region. You can see there's a lot of peakiness to it, and it's a lot more dispersed than that first image we showed you. You can see pretty high density around downtown. If you look a little bit farther south toward Irvine, there's a little bit more of a pocket of concentration. Let me switch here to density in 2014. You can see the numbers went up quite a bit, but you still have the same pattern. And what you get a lot of are these things that we call subcenters. They're not the downtown, but they're areas of concentrated employment that exist around the region, and they're very important to kind of understanding and to bounding and to understand for promoting local employment. So we set out to do a systematic analysis of the employment centers across the region using a really fine-grained data source that hasn't been analyzed all that thoroughly. We use what we call this Reference USA Business Establishment data set. It's provided by, it's a commercial data set provided by Info Group, and it provides the precise spatial location of every single business establishment across the region. There are over 900,000 in Southern California. And this image here shows the name of a lot of these little business establishments. The image here is of downtown Long Beach. And you can see if you pan around here, there's a Subway, there are some ATMs, an RV park. Just gives you kind of a tour of what's important in the region. What's very interesting about this type of a fine-grained data set of employment is you really get to see how these local economic geographies play out. What I've done here in this map, and this is of Orange County, I believe those two freeways in the middle are the intersection of the 405 and the 55 freeway, so this is somewhat near Irvine and Costa Mesa. What I've done is to put every business establishment here as a little black cross, and I've overlaid this distribution over the land use in 2012 in the region. Now you can see there's definitely notable employment concentration along some of these main arterial roads. You can see a North-South Street here. You can see concentration along major intersections and shopping malls. But what really stands out is that a lot of businesses are actually located in residential areas. Single-family housing is shown here in this kind of pale yellow color. So you can see that a lot of the distribution of employment in business establishments is actually outside of what we consider these main regions. So that's another reason why this is a really important thing to understand. So we're going to try to go through this in a fairly systematic manner to understand the concentration and density of employment in Southern California. So step one in identifying these things that we call subcenters is to overlay grid cells across the entire urbanized area. These are 1 kilometer grid cells, and the intent of this is just to kind of create a level playing field between all parts of the region, whether it's a residential area or a commercial area or what have you. Step two is to use a technique called locally weighted regression to find the cells that have a significantly higher density of employment than their neighboring areas, and those are shown here in red. The third step is to search the neighborhoods around these local maxima, these local peaks of employment, and we find that using about a 4-mile radius or so around them preserves this notion that we're looking at concentrated areas. And finally, we use the same regression technique to add the continuous areas around each local maxima that also have a higher density than their surroundings. And this is done so that we can draw boundaries around these subcenters to see which areas are included in them, which areas are part of those local maxima, and which are not. So what we get once we do this are 46 subcenters across the region in 1997, and we're defining the region here as Los Angeles, Orange, Riverside, Ventura, and San Bernardino counties. I'm going to have to apologize in advance for those of you listening in from Ventura County or maybe further on the Inland Empire. The screen here is a square, and it's not big enough to show everything at once. So fortunately, we have our web mapping applications to help with that, and I'll be going into those in just a little bit. So you can see your local subcenters if you're not in this view right now, so don't panic. All right, back to the actual presentation. We have 46 subcenters in 1997. And 53 subcenters across the region in 2014. I just want to highlight some basic overall trends here. If you look at where these are located, they don't really cover all that much of the region's land area. Actually, they only cover about 3% of the urbanized extent of Southern California. What's also interesting to note here is that there's a small but growing portion of regional employment that's in these subcenters. In 1997, about 17.4% of the region's employment was in one of these concentrated areas. And in 2014, this went up to 19.6%. So as a general rule of thumb, right now about 1 in 5 jobs are in a subcenter or are in a concentrated area. So the vast majority of employment is actually outside of these concentrated centers. The next thing that we actually wanted to do here, and I'm not sure if you can see the animated portions of this slide or not. It doesn't look like you can, so my apologies for that. But we wanted to look at 5 economic sectors here that are kind of key interest for a variety of reasons. The first are these what we call knowledge-intensive business services, or are abbreviated as KIBS. And these are things like business consulting, engineering, attorneys, kind of this higher-end type of employment. What we show here, and this is highlighted here in yellow, and again, my apologies for not having the animations up in here, What I show here is what's called a location quotient. And a location quotient is a measure of, well, I'd say, disproportionate representation. So if you look toward KIBS and you look at the location quotient for 1997, you'll see that it's a 1.437. That indicates that there's quite a highly disproportionate representation of KIBS in these employment subcenters because the score is above 1. So that indicates that KIBS have somewhat of proclivity to existing in concentrated areas. Now, if you look across to 2014, you'll see this actually goes down a bit by 2014 to 1.278. So business services are decreasingly concentrated in employment centers, but still pretty substantially so. High-tech employment there at the bottom shows a somewhat interesting story because in 1997, these were pretty much evenly dispersed across the region. You can see that location quotient is just a little bit below 1. But it actually increases to about 1.3 by 2014. So we can see that high-tech employment is much more concentrated in these centers recently. Industrial employment, well, we kind of know that the manufacturing economy in Southern California has a long history, but it's been in decline for some time. We can see that location quotient actually increasing a bit from 0.896 in 1997 to just a little bit over 1. So we have this unexpected increase in the tendency for industrial employment to concentrate. And the final couple of industries we look at here, what we call creative employment. Now there's been a lot of emphasis, especially when it comes to promoting local economic development, of the importance of what's termed the creative class. These are things in arts, recreation, and entertainment that are kind of seen as vibrant areas within cities that are desirable to live in and take advantage of. But if you're actually looking at employment within this sector, it doesn't have a very high propensity to concentrate in these areas. You can see the location quotient goes from about a 0.94, and it actually goes down to 0.889. Finally, retail is pretty evenly dispersed across the region. It shows a slight tendency toward concentration. Well, anyway, let's go to some maps because that tends to be a really great tool for visualizing some of these trends. I'm going to share my screen with you here. All right, I think you can see the web map or the MFI website. I'm going to go down to our web maps here and select the web map on employment subcenters in Southern California. And I'll give you a little tour of employment centers in the region here. So this is our the first of our web mapping applications, and first I'm going to just take a look at, I'm going to select 2014. I'm going to look at specialization because this shows the actual location quotient. And just for a flavor, why don't we pick high-tech specialization and then hit go. This shows the level of tech specialization in varying shades of blue. Red means it's not an employment center in 2014. You can see the tech is really heavily concentrated in this area by LAX, not as heavily in some other areas. What you can also do here is pick a subcenter, for example, Glendale, and on the bottom it'll show you where Glendale falls compared to the rest of the subcenters in the region in terms of tech specialization in this little histogram right here. What really is kind of neat and stands out, if I go to category and select here the highest category in 2014 and hit refresh, what I can see here is the kind of the chief specialization of each of these subcenters. I've highlighted for each subcenter which of these 5 industries has the highest concentration. So that's kind of a measure of an area's unique strength. You can see here, if I zoom in to kind of the downtown LA area and a little bit north of it, you can see that downtown LA, Glendale, and Pasadena show a particularly high location quotient in business services, so that's kind of what they're specialized in. Retail tends to exist a lot more dispersed across the region. You can see a lot of retail-centric subcenters up here in Ventura County. I promise I'd eventually get to Ventura County. There you go. Here in Simi Valley and Thousand Oaks. And again, along some major transportation corridors, like here in the San Gabriel Valley, these subcenters tend to be most specialized in retail compared to anything else. Tech jobs, like I already showed you, have a much increased propensity to existing in subcenters overall, and you can see they're concentrated in some particular areas, like up here around Northridge. Looks like my mouse is a little bit slow at times to responding on the webinar. down here in Long Beach and Irvine as well. Now, the creative class employment, which again is stuff like arts, entertainment, and recreation, this is often thought of as kind of a key ingredient in a local, in attracting talented individuals and creating a vibrant region. Overall, it's not as concentrated in centers, but there are some key areas that stand out. Not unexpectedly, this region kind of near Beverly Hills and West Hollywood, up here in Burbank, and then down in Anaheim. Pan all the way to Anaheim here. That's clearly the area surrounding Disney. I'm going to switch to view changes up here on the right, and this is going to give you kind of a flavor of how these employment subcenters shifted between 1997 and 2014. We actually calculated a persistence score for each of these centers to gauge how stable they are or how much their boundaries actually shift over time. And this is something that's really facilitated by not only our identification technique, but by this point-based business establishment data that we were able to use for this study. You can see, again, if I go to downtown Los Angeles, Glendale, and Pasadena, that these are fairly stable subcenters. What you're seeing here is the 1997 subcenters in blue, the 2014 subcenters in yellow, and any area where they overlap is being shown to you in green. So these areas have very high persistence because their boundaries don't change that much. Pasadena shrinks in size just a little bit. You can see that blue area that was no longer part of a subcenter in 2014. Some areas shift very dramatically, though. Up here in the San Fernando Valley, for example, the local peak of employment in Burbank actually shifts quite a bit from this area here over toward little downtown Burbank and the corridor near the 405. The same thing takes place farther west in the San Fernando Valley. I want to illustrate, too, a subcenter that has a very low persistence score because these spatial shifts, kind of represent shifts in these local economies. So down here in Torrance, we can see that in 1997, shown here in the blue, employment concentration was heavy around, I believe this is Hawthorne Boulevard, running here north and south through Torrance, and I believe this is Torrance Boulevard here. But by 2014, the employment concentration of the region shifted quite a bit, a lot closer to the intersection of the 405 and the 105 freeways. So this is a subcenter with a very low persistence score, and it's indicative of a pretty substantial shift in the region's employment concentration. We get another great example of the contrast in these subcenters if we pan down here to central Orange County and look at the two subcenters that are in Irvine. The one here further north is kind of the main area. You wouldn't necessarily call it downtown Irvine, but kind of the cluster of a lot of business activity near John Wayne Airport. And you can see that expanded just a little bit here in 2014. It grew, I believe that's South Coast Plaza Shopping Mall, but it changed just a little bit. So this has a very high persistence score. It's a very persisting subcenter. If we go farther south to this other area of concentrated employment in Irvine, we can see that in 1997, employment concentration was the highest in this blue region, which is kind of centered around a couple of major arterials. It looks like Alton Parkway, and I believe that is Barranca Parkway over there. But by 2014, the locus of employment shifted quite a bit. It shifted kind of westward, more toward the I-5, I-405 junction. And one of the major shifts that happened in the 1990s here was the construction of the Irvine Spectrum Center Mall, which really contributed pretty dramatically to shifting the locus of employment concentration in the region. So, I encourage you to kind of explore this web map and find these interesting shifts here. We've also made an identical map that instead of, it's got basically the same data, but instead of looking at subcenters, we have each city in Southern California. And the way I have it showing here is each city based on its highest, the industry in which it's highest, it shows the highest specialization, whether that be creative, industrial, business services, retail, or tech. So again, a really great thing for kind of understanding what a region's key specialty might be. So I'm going to go back and wrap up this report with just a couple of other features. Let me switch over to the report itself again. A couple other things that we were able to look at, kind of more in the aggregate rather than showing the locationally specific things on a map. We wanted to understand whether certain industries tend to cluster into what we call emerging, persisting, or dying cells. And I can switch back and just give you, an indication of that. Again, when I'm talking about a persisting cell, that's kind of these green regions. An emerging area would be the new areas that are part of employment concentration, whether that's an entirely new subcenter or a new portion of a subcenter. And the blue areas, I probably should have picked a little bit better of a term than dying. It's not a dying region. It's just not a part of the subcenter in 2014. So don't worry if you live in the blue. But what I tried to do here was we tried to compare these emerging, dying, and persisting cells based on the level of specialization in these various industries. And again, I don't think my animation is going to work here in this presentation, but we can see here if we look at KIBS to the left, it has the highest location quotient in these persisting cells. So what that tells us is that business services employment tends to exist more heavily and to specialize more heavily in these more stable areas like Irvine, downtown Los Angeles, Glendale, etc. Retail, for example, doesn't show that much of a proclivity toward any of the cells, but if anything, emerging areas have a higher retail location quotient, which is kind of makes sense in terms of construction of new shopping areas and new destinations. Again, creative employment has very low location quotients across the board, maybe a little bit higher in emerging, but that again indicates that this sector is not as much drawn to centers. Industrial employment, like we mentioned before, seems to be drawn toward emerging areas, which is a little bit counterintuitive. And high-tech areas show a much higher location quotient in emerging areas, a very low location quotient, and this is notable in persisting areas. So tech seems to be associated with really high flux. A lot of new areas, not as much in persisting areas. And the final piece of analysis that we did for this report were to analyze, are these emerging cells somehow systematically different in where they're actually located across the region. So this little table here just shows you the average distance of an emerging cell, that's again a cell that's newly a part of a subcenter, a persisting cell or a dying cell, which is no longer a part of a subcenter. And it shows you the distance on average of each of these to 5 different things: downtown LA, the nearest freeway, the nearest airport, the coastline, or the nearest rail line. And rail line meaning passenger rail, that's a combination of LA Metro or Metrolink. And what really stands out, it's actually quite strikingly different, that emerging cells are systematically closer to all of these things. For example, an average emerging cell is only about 11.5 kilometers from its nearest airport, whereas the persisting and dying cells are 24 or 26 kilometers from their nearest airport. So we do see that these newer areas tend to be closer to existing fixed infrastructure. Finally, just kind of wrapping up our tour through job density across the region. And again, I apologize for lack of animation, but some areas clearly remain persistently vibrant, but there are other areas that show pretty dramatic spatial and compositional changes. These emerging centers tend to be closer to fixed infrastructure, and KIBS, or business services employment, remain an important component of these stable employment centers. And that might in some ways justify a little bit of the focus of policymakers on retaining this type of employment, because it does tend to be associated with longer lasting or persistent employment concentration. High tech appears to be a major driver of new and of expanding centers of activity, but creative employment, on the contrary, does not. Industrial employment is associated with growing concentration, and maybe it deserves of a second look in Southern California. But again, I want to emphasize too that most jobs are actually created outside of subcenters. Only about 1 in 5 jobs are in these concentrated areas. So the economic geography of the region really does rely heavily on other areas. And the final point I kind of wanted to make here, again, if you were to look at that app, the web mapping application of Southern California cities, is the importance of taking into account existing locational advantages. A lot of these areas vary quite a bit in the mix of types of jobs and everything, and it's worthwhile to take a very localized view as to what's happening in a particular region. So I think John's been keeping an eye on some of the questions that we might have been getting in. John,
Yeah, Kevin, thanks much for that presentation. Yeah, this is a moment to remind folks, if you have questions throughout the presentation, feel free at any time to type those in for us. And one we have that came up, a question, Kevin, you could address this. Someone asked, where does the data come from?
The data is it's a data product called Reference USA, and it's put together by a company called Info Group. They provide this longitudinal data set. It's rooted, I believe, John, if I'm not mistaken, in business license listings, but they actually go and verify the local establishments and the number of employees and sales volumes and everything like that there. So
correct.
This business is, it used to be that we would rely on census data, census-based measures, which don't actually have these points here. I think I can go back to that slide that was being asked about. There we go, land use in Orange County. And what's great about this is you have an address which can be coded into an XY coordinate. And we somewhat painstakingly had Young and Kim, the graduate student in our group, go and verify the accuracy of the geocoding of these things and was able to match with, I think, like a 96 or 99% match rate, quite high. So this does represent the business location a lot better than some of those aggregated measures that you get from the Census Bureau, which are usually census tracts or block groups or something a lot bigger. So thanks for the question. And again, if you've got any questions or anything like that, feel free to type them in.
Great, thanks much, Kevin. Yeah, and it's that we did have the addresses, and the geocoding is not a trivial point. That was a lot of work that went into that, but the result is a quite rich data set. So with that said, let me talk to you a little bit about our second quarterly report, Understanding Business Churning Dynamics and Their Spatial Variation. Again, the same research team did this. As I mentioned before, Jae-Hong Kim actually was the lead on this. He just isn't available today to present this, so I'm going to talk about some of these results in this project. Again, this was using the same data set as what Kevin used in his presentation, but also I'm going to show where we're combining this with some census data and some other sources to ask some various questions about business churning. So we started with this question of what is business churning, and why are we interested in business churning? Well, business churning, has to do with basically the birth and death of jobs and industries, businesses, if you will. And to the extent businesses die out, that you might think that's negative, but then there's another viewpoint out there, what some economists refer to as creative destruction, which is to say that in a vibrant economy, you'll have some businesses dying out, but that's simply because they're being replaced by other new businesses that are in new industries and doing new things, and that's a healthy thing. But then our question was, well, that may well be at the macro level, but what are the consequences down at the local neighborhood level if you have a high degree of churning? Maybe churning at the macro scale is fine. It's a sign of a vibrant economy, whereas if it occurs at a neighborhood level, that can have some negative consequences for the people living there, or not, and that's our question here. So again, what is business churning? Is it the birth of a business establishment? Is it the death of a business establishment? Or in fact, is it both? And so that's what we wanted to focus on here. And again, what are the consequences for neighborhoods? So how might we measure churning? We tried a few different ways to measure it, one of which you might measure it by job change, if you will. That is to say, as a job either comes or goes, that could be one measure of churning, if you will. And so this is a chart here showing the several counties in the region. Here we've actually got 7. We actually include Imperial County in here as well as San Diego. Always a debate whether San Diego is part of our region, but for this graph it is. There you go. But this is job turnover rates by county level data, and more aggregate, so we could go back to the early 1990s and chart out this pattern. and it does seem to be a general downward trend in more recent years of job churning. Of course, that was a point in time when the economy, was struggling quite a bit, so that might point to the fact that, job churning can be actually a good thing, at least at a macro scale. But other than that, no real interesting patterns jump out from there, other than, or at least no changing patterns, I should say. Imperial has, higher churning in general, but other than that, no real clear patterns that pop out. So our second question, or a second way to measure churning, was to say, well, what if we measure it based on reallocation across industries? That is to say, to what extent we see a business die that's in one particular industry and it's replaced by a business in another industry, and if we define it in that manner, what do we see? And here it's even uglier, if you will, a spaghetti plot, if you will, of industrial churning by county using this measure. And again, this is from starting around 2000 up until more recently. And again, we don't see a real clear pattern here at the larger scale when we're focusing at this. Looking at the change between a change in industry, if you will. But so that leads to our third approach, and sort of our preferred approach, if you will. And we said, well, we want to measure churning by establishment turnover. So there may be individual jobs that come or go, or maybe but we wanted to say no, we're most interested in an establishment actually turning over. And furthermore, we were interested in an establishment, even if it's a change within the same industry, right? If a business goes out, folds, and is replaced by someone else, that can still have consequences for the people that were working in those jobs. They're not necessarily getting those same jobs back, so it could have consequences.
And John, let me make one quick little point about this.
Yeah.
This is again where this rich data source really comes into play here, because you're not really able to track the deaths of business establishments without actually having data on the precise location of business establishments. So that again is really helpful into our understanding of this process again at the neighborhood level. So
yeah, that's a very important point. And so with this point level data that we have, we could then ask, where does this churning occur? And that's what I want to talk about a little bit now. And again, best to see that, we want to show you some of the maps. It might be a best way to do that. I got recentered here. So here we've gone again back to our web mapping application, and in this map here, and we're zooming down to the Irvine and South County area, what this is capturing, we did a few different approaches. In an early map, we just mapped out how much churning do you see in neighborhoods, and that's you can look at that map if you wish. It's harder to see the pattern. This was another approach where we did what are referred to as LISA maps in the geography literature, which is local indicators of spatial association.
Spatial autocorrelation.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's an important distinction right there.
Yeah. So what we're looking at is to what extent do we see neighborhoods, and here we're using census tracts as the neighborhood. To what extent do you see a high churning in a neighborhood and also high churning in the nearby neighborhoods, or conversely low churning in a neighborhood and then low churning in surrounding areas? And these red areas are the high. And again, so these neighborhoods here, and you're seeing this Irvine Costa Mesa area here, as well over here into South County a bit, are areas where there's high churning in a neighborhood, but also high churning in the surrounding areas. So this is, again, isn't saying what are the consequences of it, but it's just saying how much churning do we see. And we do see quite a bit going on in here, which could be either a good or bad thing. We'll get to that in a moment. But that's where we see a lot of churning. Conversely, if we go up into, this is the western part of LA, or Orange County rather, a lot of this area in here, there's just no spatial pattern. But here, and this western part of Orange County, we see some areas where there's relatively low churning, both in the neighborhood and the surrounding areas. So they pop up as larger areas of spatial non-churning, if you will. Likewise, we see that if we come into the Long Beach area and then we cut up into South Central LA, and then on up into the San Gabriel Valley. Again, in all these neighborhoods, we see spatial patterning of low churning, if you will, areas that neighborhoods with low churning, and then surrounding by low churning as well. Contrast when we come over into the downtown area and then over into Century City and towards the west side. Again, we see much more high levels of churning going on in those areas. Likewise, out into the valley, just a bit, some high churning, but not a lot. And finally, when we look over to the Inland Empire area, we again see areas that have high amounts of churning, and then surrounded by high amounts of churning. So this is interesting. We're seeing where we're seeing high or low churning or spatial patterns of it don't necessarily map on to areas where you'd say, oh, yeah, those are clearly new areas or emerging areas or older areas. There does seem to be a bit of a mix in that regard. So our next question we wanted to ask, okay, well, what are the consequences of this churning for neighborhoods? And to do that, we were in particular interested in three characteristics of vibrant neighborhoods. How much job growth is there? How much increase in the average income level of residents? And then how much change in the average home values in neighborhoods? So we used those as our three metrics and estimated some simple models and said, okay, to what extent is churning associated with these? One very interesting pattern we found was that, in general, our models trying to explain the consequences of churning for these different outcomes really didn't do a very good job when we did them as models explaining the entire region at the same time. The variance explained was not very good. Instead, when we moved to a different set of models referred to as geographically weighted regression, these are models that basically are trying to estimate the model in different regions of the area at different time points. So it's trying to say, okay, what does the model look like if we focus in, say, Orange County area or certain parts of it there? That's a bit of a simplification of what the model's doing, but it gives you a rough idea of what's going on. And when we do that, what we find is that first of all, the model did a much, much better job of explaining the variance in job growth or income change or home value change. And second of all, when we map this, we see some very big differences. So what it's telling us is that the consequences of churning are different depending on what part of the region you're looking at. So for instance, in this map here, the outcome is looking at job growth in areas. And the yellow is effectively no relationship, and that's kind of Costa Mesa here, where you have, whether the amount of churning really doesn't seem to have much relationship to job growth. On the other hand, when we move down here towards South County, we see that actually neighborhoods that have a high level of job churning actually have more job growth. So basically here, this is consistent with this idea of creative destruction, that the churning of jobs is related to job growth, so it has a positive consequence for them. But again, Costa Mesa and North Orange County, not so. There's really not much of a relationship for them there. When we move over into the LA area, again, along the coast here, or along the South Bay area and then up into Santa Monica, not much of a relationship. On the other hand, when we come into the areas near downtown and over a bit into the South LA area, we're seeing a positive relationship. So again, in these locations, job churning leads to more job growth for these neighborhoods. An interesting area here, the Huntington Park area, one of the biggest negative relationships for this, in the sense that neighborhoods that have a high amount of churning actually have job loss. So a very different pattern in here than what we see in some of these other areas in downtown, where churning has a positive consequence in downtown, has a negative consequence in Huntington Park. Moving into the valley, again, we see for much of it a relatively, somewhat at least, positive relationship between churning and growth, but not so in Burbank or then when we move into Pasadena and Altadena. And likewise, when we move into the Inland Empire, we see kind of mixed results. For certain parts, not much of a relationship, but for other parts, we do see that the amount of churning has positive consequences for job growth. One more set of results I want to show is the consequences of churning for the change in income in neighborhoods. So again, focusing on the Orange County area, and again, this blue is showing a positive relationship. So what we're finding in much of Orange County down here is that neighborhoods that have a lot of churning are seeing a big, a relative appreciation in the income of residents in those neighborhoods. So again, churning seems to have a real positive consequence, and particularly here these in North Irvine, a very big positive effect. But then when you get down to South County, South Orange County, not so much, and in fact, the relationship actually turns negative when we get down towards San Clemente. Neighborhoods there, seeing a lot of job churning, actually see less appreciation in the income of residents there. And likewise, then when we move over into LA County, we see a different pattern. So again, where Orange County churning had a real positive consequence for income in neighborhoods, we see that a bit when we look at the South Bay down here. For other parts of LA, we see a very different relationship. And again, this explains why our initial models, which treated the whole region uniformly, were not doing a very good job. In fact, the consequences of churning vary very much depending on which neighborhoods you look at. And again, when we come back into downtown LA, again, the relationship flips once again and becomes a positive one. Churning has positive consequences for LA and into Glendale, and likewise over here into the South El Monte area. So we see some varying results for the consequences of churning. So let me wrap up here since we're running short on time. What do we conclude from this? Well, job churning occurs differently across different locations, and we saw that on the initial map that in fact some places see a lot of churning, others not so much. Our second question, which we said, was what are the consequences of job churning? And it was particularly notable and quite interesting to us that the consequences differ depending on where you're looking, that in some locations job churning has these positive consequences, neighborhoods seem to benefit, but in other locations job churning seems to have negative consequences. Naturally, that's a very interesting set of results for us, and that's a natural next step for us in future work, is to ask what explains these differences across locations. Like I said, it's not clear that you look at it and it jumps out and says, oh yeah, these are new regions or something like that, or these are older industrial areas. Doesn't seem to be the case. So that's something we want to explore more as we use these data more. And then the final point we want to make here is that these local economic development plans need to be aware of these region-wide trends in job churning, of course, but they also need to be aware of the consequences that for particular neighborhoods. So a one-size-fits-all plan may not be the ideal way to do things. And with that, Kevin?
Yeah. So I'd like to make another couple of points overall about this, about the way our research here at the MFI has been going. We're at a really interesting point with a lot of these high-resolution data sets, and especially high-resolution spatial data sets. The approach of social scientists, we look at the social ecology of a region and neighborhood change and a lot of the processes behind it. John, in particular, has done a lot of work on crime patterns and crime in neighborhoods, and I've done a lot more work kind of on development trends and land use change. But using these business establishment data, and we've actually started to use land parcel data a lot more in our research as well. I showed you that one slide a bit earlier. This is really getting into somewhat new territory for those who study kind of social science and social ecology. We're really used to looking at things at an aggregated level, but now when we're looking at actual business establishments and patterns based on different buildings, ages of buildings, and the size of dwelling units and things like that, this gets us into territory where we're a lot closer to kind of these community-based processes. Shifts in commercial real estate trends, residential development trends, or little economic trends shift a lot of these very fine-grained neighborhood-level things. And we're able to see that on an aggregated scale, not only Orange County, but as you can see, the whole region. So it's kind of a plug for increased community engagement. We'd like to hear back, from you as to what are kind of important issues in your neck of the woods in terms of your industry or your actual place. So that we can disseminate this research better, but so that we can also learn ourselves about what kind of questions are important to everybody.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Kevin, and that has been a goal of the MFI from the beginning, is to explore these various questions, and the better data we get, the better questions we can address various questions, and certainly that's certainly the case here in this Reference USA data that we've been using. Like I said, we've combined it with all sorts of census data and crime data and other things like that. That's another part of this which we could have talked about today, but we didn't, is what are the consequences of churning for crime as well. And in some of these analyses we just use census tracts, but we could use various ways of measuring neighborhoods, just as Kevin used an interesting clustering technique to find these clusters of
job density.
Mm-hmm. We could do a similar thing. We've talked about this with smaller units, and certainly geographers have done this in various ways, trying to measure neighborhoods rather than just simply taking predefined boundaries that may not conform to what people think of as their neighborhoods. We have the ability to do that as well with the data, and so that's more exciting possibilities for us.
Patricia, anything else?
Yeah, I think that's it. If no one has any additional questions, then we'll wrap it up, since we are coming to the end of our hour and we want to respect everyone's time. If you do have any questions that you think of after this presentation, feel free to visit the MFI website and reach out to John and Kevin. They're happy to hear from you. And thank you so much again. As I mentioned before, we are recording this presentation, and we will send you the replay link later this week for you to watch again or share with other colleagues. And again, thank you for joining us, and have a great day.